On the last episode, you were introduced to the Roman Emperor Constantine. Constantine is remembered for a lot of things. Constantine was the first Christian emperor. At least that's what many people think. There's plenty to say about his conversion, and although we can't get into his mind, we can look at some of the evidence to get a sense of what kind of Christian Constantine was and the extent to which he elevated Christianity from its former status as a persecuted, marginalized religion in the Roman Empire to a dominant force in virtually all aspects of Roman society. After studying Constantine for many years, I'm convinced that he was sincere in his personal commitment to Christianity, but he was at the same time influenced by traditional Roman religion as well. So what do we make of Constantine? How do we dissect his religious views? And was he truly the first Christian emperor? We will talk about these things on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 84, Constantine's Conversion to Christianity. So if you listened to that introduction, you know already my argument. I think that Constantine's conversion was genuine. At the same time, he was a political pragmatist, and he had grown up with ideas about Roman religion that influenced how he thought about Christianity. And just for purposes of review, let's go over what religion had been like in the Roman Empire over the previous century or two. This is the world which shaped Constantine's views on religion. The first thing to remember is that the Roman Empire was religiously diverse. Polytheism reigned. There were local cults, animistic ideas still seeping around there. There was also syncretism at the same time. We had emperors like Aurelian advocating for a kind of single religion under the god Sol Invictus. There was emperor worship. As I mentioned before, belief in these gods, at least in terms of a kind of theology or maybe even orthodox views about these gods, such was not as important as participating in the correct religious rituals and rites. And it was the emperor's job amidst all of this religious diversity to maintain divine harmony, to keep the gods, whoever they were, happy with the Roman Empire and its people. And Christianity was, in many respects, opposed to this religious order. Yes, it was monotheistic, but Christians refused to participate in traditional rites and rituals. They did not see the emperor as divine or needing to be worshipped. And Christians, by not participating in the public religions of the Roman Empire, were jeopardizing, at least in the minds of many Romans, not only religious harmony, but the gods' intervention in this world for good. If the gods saw that there were sections of the population not doing what they were supposed to do, they might withhold their blessing or even worse, inflict punishment. And so Christians were persecuted on again and off again, and especially on again under Diocletian from 303 AD. We talked about that in the last episode. That was the Great Persecution, in which churches were destroyed, scriptures were burned, Christians were tortured and killed. And this was the case in many parts of the Roman Empire, but not everywhere. Under Constantine's father, Constantius, particularly in the northwestern provinces of the Roman Empire, so Great Britain and Gaul in particular, the religious persecution was nominal at best, and Christians were free, for the most part, to practice their religion unmolested. But once Constantine's father died in 306, there was chaos in that part of the Roman Empire. There was supposed to be an orderly transfer of power, but Constantine decided that he ought to be one of the emperors, despite the fact that the system had bypassed him. So what was supposed to be a stable tetrarchic system of 4 emperors passing on power through a meritocracy quickly devolved into civil war. And it's in the midst of this instability and period of persecution that Constantine fought for his right to rule at least part of the Roman Empire. There are two primary sources that speak to Constantine's conversion. And I want to quote from both of these accounts, which are different, and try to parse together what may have actually happened. So the first account is from Lactantius. He was a Christian teacher and tutor and rhetorician who lived in the 4th century AD during the time of Constantine and his sons. And Lactantius wrote an account of Roman history during this time. And he claims that when Constantine was preparing to take Rome from another usurper, Maxentius, son of the previous emperor Maximian in the west, Constantine, according to Lactantius, had a dream. And in the dream, he was told, quote, to cause the heavenly sign to be delineated on the shields of his soldiers, and so to proceed to battle. He did as he had been commanded, and he marked on their shields the letter Chi, with a perpendicular line drawn through it, and turned round thus at the top, being the cipher of Christ. Having this sign, his troops stood to arms. And that's Lactantius in his On the Deaths of the Persecutors. What Lactantius describes is Constantine having a dream, not unlike many Roman emperors who had religious dreams and were told to do particular things or not do particular things. Some of those emperors obeyed those signs, some of them didn't, but Constantine obeyed. He decided to mark a Chi rho, which are the first two letters of Christ in Greek, on the shields of his soldiers, and as a result of his piety, he won a victory over Maxentius and took Rome for himself. It's a very pragmatic narrative, emphasizing the military outcome without going too much into the theological implications of what Constantine dreamt. The account is the earliest of the two records of Constantine's conversion, which gives it some credibility. The next account, which is written later, is more detailed, but it is also different. And this is the account of Eusebius in his life of Constantine. Eusebius was a Christian bishop and historian who wrote his life of Constantine after Constantine died in 337 AD. Eusebius claims that he heard the story directly from Constantine. The account is much longer. I've tried to only quote the most relevant portions here, but I'd like to give you an extended reading from Eusebius's life of Constantine and notice some of the differences and some of the details in his account. And before I get started, I'll just mention as well that Eusebius's account actually begins before the battle against Maxentius. And it starts with Constantine wondering which god he ought to worship. Quote, being convinced that he needed some more powerful aid than his military forces could afford him on account of the wicked and magical enchantments which were so diligently practiced by the tyrant Maxentius, Constantine sought divine assistance. He considered what god he might rely on for protection and assistance. While engaging in this inquiry, the thought occurred to him that of the many emperors who had preceded him, those who had rested their hopes in a multitude of gods and served them with sacrifices and offerings had in the first place been deceived by flattering predictions and oracles which promised them all prosperity and at last had met with an unhappy end, while none of their gods had stood by to warn them of the impending wrath of heaven. And then I'll move a little forward. Quote, while the God of his father had given to him, on the other hand, manifestations of his power and very many tokens, he judged it to be folly indeed to join in the idol worship of those who were no gods, and after such convincing evidence to err from the truth, and therefore felt it incumbent on him to honor his father's God alone. Accordingly, he called on him with earnest prayer and supplication that he would reveal to him who he was and stretch forth his right hand to help him in his present difficulties. And while he was thus praying with fervent entreaty, a most marvelous sign appeared to him from heaven, the account of which it might have been hard to believe had it been related by any other person. But since the victorious emperor himself long afterward declared it to the writer of this history, when he was honored with his acquaintance in society, and confirmed his statement by an oath, who could hesitate to accredit the relation, especially since the testimony of after time has established its truth? He said that about noon, when the day was already beginning to decline, he saw with his own eyes the trophy of a cross of light in the heavens above the sun, and bearing the inscription, "By this sign, conquer." At this sight he himself was struck with amazement, and his whole army also, which followed him on the expedition and witnessed the miracle. I'll stop reading there. That is Eusebius's Life of Constantine, some selections both from chapter 27 and chapter 28. So I apologize for the long quotation, but there is a lot in there that is very interesting. First, Constantine's conversion doesn't happen in just a moment at the Milvian Bridge while he's about to fight Maxentius. Actually, according to Eusebius, Constantine had been puzzling about religious things for some time. And I skipped over quite a bit, but the source mentions how Constantine was kind of weighing back and forth. Okay, on the one hand, there are these emperors that have worshipped the traditional gods, but the traditional gods didn't always help them, and they fell into folly. Meanwhile, Constantine's father, who evidently was a Christian, or at least worshipped the Christian God, had been successful, at least according to Eusebius. Now, this is, by the way, glossing over some things. I mean, Constantius, for one thing, was only emperor for about a year. He died at age 56, which is not exactly an old age for a Roman elite. And we don't know how he died. He may have died of sickness. He may have died of murder. We just have no idea. But I wouldn't say that Constantius had a fortunate life, at least from what we know. We also have no evidence that he was a Christian, only that he was tolerant towards Christians. But according to Eusebius, Constantine's father was enough of a seeker of God, perhaps, that Constantine decided to ask some questions. And besides, Constantine was in a pretty desperate state. He was in the middle of a civil war with Maxentius. And Maxentius had evidently engaged in some kind of magic or dark spirituality of some kind, at least according to the source, and Constantine needed to counter that with a more powerful piety. All of this suggests that Constantine, at least around the time of his conversion, viewed Christianity much like any Roman would view any religion. Constantine is looking for the right thing to do to please the most powerful gods, which evidently to him is the Christian God. And the thing that he's supposed to do is to conquer in the sign of the cross. And that may be why Lactantius even mentions putting a Christian symbol on the shields of the army. This makes total sense for a traditional Roman who would have seen no problem carrying images of various gods or good luck charms or using incantations or other forms of kind of superstitious activity to ensure that a battle went well. Constantine is effectively doing something pretty similar. As for the account itself, Eusebius says that Constantine told him this account directly, in person, and that Constantine swore an oath saying that it was true. Now, does that mean that Lactantius was lying? No. It could be that both accounts speak to different aspects of the conversion story, that something supernatural happened, not just with Constantine, but with Constantine's army, such that a symbol or a sign was given to them that they would be successful, and then they were. And one of the things that Eusebius says is, we know that Constantine's story is true because he was victorious, which again is a very Roman way of seeing things. How do you know your worship was accepted by the gods? Well, if they brought you benefit, then they're happy with your worship. Now, does this mean that once Constantine had this experience, that he immediately rejected his non-Christian beliefs, that he stopped allowing emperor worship, for example, and maybe put crosses all over Rome? Well, no, not exactly. There's plenty of evidence that Constantine's relationship with Christianity was an evolving one. Constantine would continue to mint coins with non-Christian deities like Sol Invictus. He also did not immediately get baptized. And this is a point that many skeptics of Constantine's conversion bring up. It wasn't until Constantine was on his deathbed in 337 AD that he accepted baptism. Was this because he wasn't really a Christian? Well, no, I think it's because he had a view of baptism that was influenced by existing ideas about religion. For Constantine, and indeed for some Christian writers around this time, baptism was viewed not just as a memorial or an initiation ritual, but as a kind of real cleansing from sin. That in order to get full forgiveness for the sins one has committed, they need to wait and be baptized at the very end because it actually washes away sin. And so it makes sense, if possible, to delay baptism until the very end of life rather than having it when one became a Christian. And Constantine apparently subscribed to this view. Constantine was ultimately a pragmatist. He wasn't just responsible for his own religion. He was the ruler at the time of his conversion of Rome and a good chunk of the Western Empire. And as he would increasingly take more and more of the empire, eventually all of it came under his control, he had to think about how his own personal faith integrated with such a religiously diverse empire. Christianity, even at the time of Constantine's conversion, was probably only practiced by around 10% of the population. Now, it was growing, and it would grow rapidly after Constantine's conversion, but it was not a majority religion. And so we see even in Constantine's triumphal arch, which he had erected after he took Rome, there is an appeal to divinity, not an appeal to, say, Jesus Christ. God is spoken of more generically. Constantine probably knew what he meant, or at least had some idea of what he meant. Such a vague term also allowed other people to interpret into it what they wanted. Constantine needed Christianity because a lot of the soldiers that he used for his early conquests were Christians or were at least open to a kind of monotheism because they were sun god worshippers. But even after Christianity was less useful to him politically, he continued to push for the political power of the church and its officials. And that suggests to me a sincere conversion. One of Constantine's first acts as a Christian ruler was issuing what is called the Edict of Milan, which was co-authored with the Emperor of the East, Licinius. This decree granted religious tolerance to all faiths, with a particular emphasis on Christianity, having a kind of line item in support of Christianity. It mandated the return of confiscated Christian property and allowed Christians to practice their faith openly. It was not a purely neutral policy. It signaled, at least for Constantine, a favoritism towards Christianity. It didn't make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire by any stretch. That would happen several decades later. But what Constantine did was integrate Christianity into the legal and social framework of the empire. It went from being a marginalized, unofficial religion to being an official public religion. Nominally equal with all the others, but given special personal preference by Constantine. And we see Constantine using his vast political power and personal wealth to benefit the church in the years after he became a Christian. He commissioned large churches, and Constantine was not merely building places where Christians could worship, but he was making it very clear that Christianity was a public religion and one that was favored by him, and that he was, in the eyes of traditional Romans, paying back the God who had helped him. This was something that Romans could understand, even if they weren't Christians. Constantine was not some wacko. He was being pious. The Christian God had helped him take Rome and the Western Empire. Constantine was, in turn, showing piety. So even non-Christians could get behind what he was doing. He was successfully threading the needle of, on the one hand, supporting the church, and on the other hand, pacifying any pagan resistance to his own Christianity by showing traditional piety. So by legalizing and also personally promoting Christianity, Constantine facilitated the growth of Christianity well beyond where it had been popular, and that is in the Roman cities. So now, instead of just urbanites becoming Christians, many in the military adopted the religion, as did people in the countryside. In fact, the term pagan comes from the Latin word pagus, which we might crudely translate into English as hick or country bumpkin, because Christianity had been an urban religion, but now it had finally moved into the countryside with Constantine's conversion and support of the church. And although it wasn't the official religion of the empire, it was a unifying religion, and in quick time, Christian laws, Christian art, Christian culture began to be seen all over the Roman Empire. So while I think that Constantine's conversion was genuine, it was also tempered by pragmatism and Constantine's own identity as a Roman. I think Constantine's vision, whatever exactly he experienced, reflects a sincere experience that he believed that he had. At the same time, it was not merely a spiritual or personal experience. And Constantine's conversion and preference of the church marked a major transition in the history of the empire, moving it from paganism to Christianity, and Constantine would establish Christianity as a founding force in his Roman Empire. This is all the more important as we will learn what happens next, which is Constantine's victory in the various civil wars of the 310s and 320s, and his founding of the city of Constantinople as a capital of the Roman Empire. How did Constantine manage to unify the Roman Empire and move the center of the empire from Rome to Constantinople? We'll talk about that on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.